At 5 in the morning in Detroit, the sky was still dark. The streetlights turned the wet asphalt a dirty yellow. I lay on the old recliner in the living room, pretending to be sound asleep. In truth, I had been waiting since 4. Soft footsteps came from the kitchen. Then the refrigerator door opened and closed. A drawer slid open. Something was being rummaged through. I opened one eye in the darkness and caught a reflection in the hallway mirror. My daughter-in-law Linda stood at the redwood desk in the study. She was holding an envelope. I knew that envelope well. I had just picked it up from my lawyer the week before. Inside was a handwritten codicil to my will and signed. The content was simple. I planned to leave the vacation house in Florida to my grandson Charlie, and everything else, the old house, the savings, the stock accounts, to my son Mark. I had not signed it because I wanted to wait for Mark to come back from a business trip in Chicago. I wanted to talk to him face to face. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking when he married that woman. Linda folded the envelope twice and slipped it into her robe pocket. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call in a low voice. I could not make out the words, but I caught lawyer, morning, and come over several times. When she hung up, she stood still for about 10 seconds. Then she padded back upstairs and closed the bedroom door. I stayed still on the recliner. A garbage truck rumbled past outside. A few pigeons landed on the old oak tree in the yard and said. I touched the key in my breast pocket. That little black key, worn smooth by 30 years of use. Anyone could rummage through the house and take whatever they wanted. But what was behind that painting, no one knew. At a quarter past 6, the sky was fully bright. Linda came downstairs in her beige skirt suit. Her hair was perfectly combed, her face powdered. She looked wide awake, nothing like someone who had only slept 4 hours. She walked into the kitchen and made coffee. She poured a cup for me and brought it to the living room. She set it on the side table next to my hand. "Morning, Dad," she said. Her voice was soft, the way you talk to a child. I nodded and said nothing. She studied my face for a moment, as if checking that I was really awake. Then she turned and went back upstairs. About 40 minutes later, the doorbell rang. It was H.A. Riss, my lawyer. He wore a navy blazer and carried a briefcase under his arm. Linda greeted him at the door and led him into the living room. They sat across from each other at the dining table. She took the envelope from her pocket, placed it on the table, and pushed it to RDM. "Dad gave this to me for safekeeping last week," she said. Her voice was clear and decisive. "He said if anything happened to him, or if his mental state declined noticeably, I was to execute it. I checked it last night and realized that this supplement he recently signed leaves everything to me. He felt Mark had not contributed enough to the family, while I have been here ring for him all along." I held my coffee cup and sat on the recliner in the living room. I had a clear view of their profiles. H.A. Riss frowned, flipped through the document, then took off his glasses and wiped them. "Mrs. Linda, this document is not signed," he said. "I know," Linda said with a smile. "But he told me verbally. That was his intent. You know how his memory has been lately. Sometimes he forgets whether he has eaten. Given that situation, his spoken wishes should be taken as the main reference, should they not?" H.A. Riss did not answer. He closed the document, placed it back in the envelope, and said he needed to confirm with me personally. Linda stood up immediately and walked over to me. She bent down, her smile saying a kind of smug certainty that made me uncomfortable. "Dad, do you remember what you told me last week about that codicil? You said you wanted to leave everything to me because you felt I took good care of you." I looked at her. I looked at her hands, resting on the arm of the recliner, the deep red nail polish gleaming, her knuckles white from gripping too hard. I took a sip of my coffee. It had gone cold. Bitter and repeat. "I do not remember," I said. Linda's smile froze for a second, then recovered. She turned to H.A. Riss and said, "You see, this is what I mean. He goes back and forth, sometimes clear sometimes confused. But last night, when he told me, he was very clear very certain." I slowly pushed myself upright in the recliner. I set the coffee cup down on the side table. My knees cracked when I stood. Old habits, from 30 years of driving a semi-truck across the country. I walked to the south wall of the living room, where a painting hung. It was done by my wife before she passed, over 15 years ago. It showed autumn woods outside Pittsburgh. The paint had cracked in places, but I kept the frame clean. I lifted the painting off its hook and leaned it against the wall. Behind it was nothing but wall, except for a small recess in the center. A metal plate sat flush with the drywall. I took the little black key from my pocket and inserted it into a NEARLY invisible keyhole on the plate. I turned it. The plate popped open, revealing a safe. Palm-sized, old mechanical dial. I spun the combination every day so I would not forget. Linda's chair scraped back half a foot. She stood up. The smile was completely gone from her face. "What is that?" Her voice came out sharper than before, but I did not turn around. I finished the combination, HRD the click, and opened the safe door. Inside lay an older will. The original. Full document, printed on legal paper, signed on every page by me and my wife, with a notary seal and my lawyer's stamp. The date was 10 years ago. My wife was still alive then. We had sat together at the kitchen table, under the lamp, reading every single word. It stated clearly that this house, the savings, the stocks, and everything else were to be split in 2 ways. Half would go to my son Mark. The other half would fund a trust for my grandson Charlie until he finished college. If I died before Mark would manage all assets. Linda's name did not appear anywhere. I pulled that will out of the safe, turned around slowly, walked back to the center of the living room, and handed it to Harris. He took it, put his glasses back on, and flipped through the pages. When he reached the 3rd page, he looked up at Linda. She stood by the dining table, both hands pressed on the back of her chair. Her knuckles were white. Her mouth opened, then closed. "This is your officially executed final will," Harris said. "That handwritten supplement you showed me has no signature and no witness. Legally speaking, it carries no weight, unless you publicly confirm it as your intent." I took the will back from Harris, folded it carefully, placed it in its envelope, and tucked it into my back pocket. "I am not mentally impaired," I said. "I walk to the corner every morning to buy my newspaper. I chat with the newsstand owner. I change my own light bulbs. I fix my own leaky faucets. I did not speak to anyone about leaving my property to anyone last night, because I went to bed at 9. I watched a show about lions hunting wildebeests. I slept soundly. No one talked to me." Linda stood frozen in front of the chair, as if a bucket of ice water had been dumped over her head. Her lips trembled. She opened her mouth to say something, but just then footsteps sounded from upstairs. My son Mark came down the stairs, dragging a suitcase behind him. His hair was messy. He had clearly just gotten off an EARLY flight and come straight home. He looked at the 3 of us in the living room, then at his wife's face, then at me. "Dad, what happened?" I did not answer. Harris packed his briefcase, stood up, and slipped the unsigned codicil into his inner folder. "Nothing," I said. "Your wife got up EARLY and invited the lawyer over for a chat. I just happened to pull out the old will to show them." Mark looked at Linda. She avoided his gaze, grabbed her CAR keys off the table, and walked quickly toward the front door. Her heels clicked RPLY on the floor. She pulled the door open and walked out without looking back. The door slammed shut behind her, rattling the painting frame where it leaned against the wall. Mark walked over to me and asked in a low voice what had really happened. I looked at his face, so much like his mother's, and pointed at the notarized copy of the will that Harris had left on the dining table. "Your wife tried to cut me out of my own house," I said. Mark sat down at the dining table and read through the notarized copy from beginning to end. When he finished, he did not speak for a long while. He rested his elbows on the table and pressed his thumbs against his temples, rubbing in slow circles. The dog across the street sta root barking and kept at it for 3 or 4 minutes. I poured myself another cup of coffee, this time hot, and sat across from him, waiting. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red, but not from crying. It was the kind of redness that came from lack of sleep and a slow-burning anger coiled tight in his chest. He asked me when Linda had sta root planning all this. I told him I did not know. I only knew she had gone through my desk drawer at 5 in the morning. Mark stood up from the table, walked to the kitchen sink, turned on the faucet, and splashed cold water over his face. He dried himself with a kitchen towel and asked me about the unsigned handwritten document. When had I written it, and why? I told him I had jotted it down the previous week. The weather was cooling off, and I had thought about taking Charlie down to Florida for a stretch in the spring. The vacation house had been sitting empty, so I wrote a rough draft. The plan was to show it to Mark and Linda, talk it over, and sign it once we all agreed. The vacation house would go to Charlie. Everything else would go to Mark. Linda's name was nowhere on it. She must have scanned the first page, spotted words like all property, and assumed it was all meant for her. Mark swore under his breath. It was not loud, but his fists clenched tight. He paced the kitchen twice, then stopped and looked at me. He said Linda had asked him the night before if I had been writing anything lately or mentioning my will. He had told her no, and that she should not overthink things while he was away. She said she was just worried about my health. He had believed her. I nodded. There was nothing more to say about it. Trusting the wrong person was its own lesson. I had driven trucks for 30 years, from Detroit to Los Angeles and back, more times than I could count. I had met every kind of person on the road and heard every kind of lie. I just never expected one to show up in my own kitchen. Around 9 in the morning, Charlie came downstairs. He was 13, tall and lean, just like his father had been at that age. He had his school backpack slung over one shoulder. He paused at the kitchen door, looked at Mark and me, read our faces, and did not ask any questions. He just said good morning to both of us, grabbed a carton of milk from the fridge, bit into a piece of bread, and headed for the front door. Just before he left, he turned back and looked at me. That look was exactly like his grandmother's. A quiet look that said he understood more than he let on. That morning, I went out to buy my newspaper as usual. Tony, the Italian-American who ran the newsstand on the corner, had been in Detroit for over 40 years. His wife and mine had been sisters in the church. I folded the paper under my arm, and Tony leaned in and asked in a low voice if I had heard that my daughter-in-law had called a lawyer to the house RLY that morning. I asked him how he knew. He said Linda had driven past his stand without stopping, and her face had looked terrible. On top of that, a friend of his who worked as a secretary at Riss's firm had gotten a call at dawn about an urgent client visit, and the address was our street. I smiled and told him it was handled. Tony patted me on the shoulder and said if I ever needed anything. He knew a few good lawyers who did not mess around. I did not answer. I took my paper and walked home slowly. By the time I got back, Mark was gone. He had left a note saying he had gone to Linda's parents' house to talk to her. I sat in the recliner, rehung the painting on the wall, locked the safe, and put the key back in my breast pocket. I looked at the autumn woods in the painting. The leaves were golden, just like the fall afternoon when my wife passed around 3 in the afternoon. Mark came back. His face was worse than when he had left. He said Linda had gone to her parents' house, and they had opened the door, but Linda refused to come out. She spoke to him through the door and said she needed space. Mark said her parents had acted strange. They had not asked what had happened. They had not tried to mediate. They just stood in the doorway and said this was a marital matter and they did not want it brought to their doorstep. Mark said he had felt something was off but had not pushed it. I stayed quiet. I sat on the couch and ran through every detail of the morning in my head. How had Linda gotten her hands on that handwritten document? I had written it and left it in the middle drawer of my desk, the one I never locked because it only held old bills and tax forms. But I did not remember telling her about it, which meant she had gone through my drawers long before that morning. That evening, Mark spent a lot of time on his phone. He said he had called Riss again and asked what would happen if Linda tried to take legal action based on that unsigned codicil. Riss had been blunt. No signature, no witness, no legal standing. A court would throw it out. But Riss had added one more thing. If Linda claimed the testator had been mentally incompetent, the court would order a medical evaluation. That would drag the case out for months. And during that time, all assets would be frozen until the judge made a ruling. Mark set his phone down and looked at me. This morning, when she called Riss, that is exactly what she said, that your mental state was failing. I swallowed a spoonful of mashed potatoes, chewed slowly, and said, then let her bring in a doctor. Tomorrow. Mark read at me like he wanted to say something, but he just nodded. That night, I lay in bed and listened to the occasional car pass by outside. I kept turning one thing over in my mind. Why had she chosen that specific morning to act? Mark was supposed to have come home the previous afternoon, but Chicago had been hit with a snowstorm and his flight had been canceled. He had rebooked for the next morning. Linda knew he would not be home until EARLY that day. That was why she had moved at 5 in the morning. She wanted to get H.A. Riss in the house, get the story locked down, and present Mark with a done deal when he walked through the door. What she had not counted on was me waking up at 4. She had not counted on the safe behind the painting. And she had certainly not counted on a fully executed will, signed and notarized 10 years ago, sitting in that safe, completely legal and completely clear. The next morning, H.A. Riss arrived with a geriatric specialist named Dr. Patel, a middle-aged man in his 50s. He write a clipboard and asked me about 40 questions. He asked what year I was born. He asked when my wife passed. He asked what I ate for breakfast and how many Pistons games I watched each week. I answered every one without hesitation. Dr. Patel closed his folder, turned to H.A. Riss, and said one sentence. This gentleman's cognitive function is fully intact. Orientation, memory, judgment all fall within normal range. There is no evidence of any mental decline whatsoever. When H.A. Riss put that evaluation into his briefcase, I saw Mark let out a long, deep breath he had been holding since the day before. He had hardly eaten in 2 days. I walked over and patted him on the back. Go eat something, I said. There is meatball soup in the kitchen. He nodded and took a step toward the kitchen. Then he stopped and turned back to face me. Dad, he said, I want a divorce. I looked at him. Have you thought it through, he said. I have. I said, then do it. The next 2 weeks moved like someone had pressed fast forward on the whole world. Mark formally hired a divorce attorney, a woman named Rodriguez who had run her own family law practice in downtown Detroit for 20 years. She had a reputation for being RP and not backing down. Linda did not stay idle. She brought in a retired judge who was an old friend of her father's and hired a mid-sized local firm to represent her. The two sides exchanged a flurry of formal letters. The issues covered property division, custody, and, to my amusement, Linda's claim that I, as a family member, had engaged in improper financial influence. She asked the court to review all my bank transfers from the past 5 years. Rodriguez called Mark after reading that motion. She laughed over the phone and said, Your father's last 5 years of transfers all to the grocery store, the utility company, and church donations. The biggest one was $600 for a used laptop he bought for his grandson. Let them dig. They will end up paying our response fees. What truly got under my skin was another thing. Linda somehow got a short piece published in the community section of a local free paper. The headline ran along the lines of elderly Detroit man accused of mental decline, daughter-in-law fights for family assets. The article did not name anyone directly, but the neighbors knew exactly whose house they were talking about. When I walked to the newsstand that morning, Tony handed me that paper with a red face. He said he would not have stocked it, but the distributor had shoved it in with the regular shipment. I folded the paper once, dropped it in the trash can on the corner, and did not mention it again. But word travels faster than you expect. 3 days later, I got a letter in the mail. I recognized the handwriting right away. It was from an old friend named Bob, someone I had driven with back in my trucking days. He had retired and moved to Arizona, but we still swapped Christmas cards every year. In his letter, he asked how I was doing. He said he had heard from another old colleague about what was going on. He asked if I needed help. At the end, he wrote, We old bones do not let people push us around. Say the word. I did not write back, but the RMTH of that note stayed with me. 30 years on the road had not given me a big circle of friends, but the ones I had were the real kind. Another week passed. The court issued a temporary reorder freezing all assets. No one could transfer, sell, or mortgage anything. That meant the Florida house was stuck in limbo. My plan to take Charlie down for a few weeks would have to wait. Charlie took it well enough. One afternoon after school, he said, Grandpa, it is fine. We can go when this is over. I am not in a hurry. The more mature he acted, the more I felt this whole thing could not just slide by. What Linda had done that morning was more than stealing a piece of paper. She had bet the whole household on the chance that I was too old to notice, that Mark would go along with it, and that the neighbors would look the other way. Now that she had lost that bet, she was slinging mud everywhere she could. By the 3rd week, Linda's side suddenly changed tactics. They became operative. Her lawyer reached out and offered a settlement. She would take half the cash in the joint checking account and the SUV she currently drove. In exchange, she would drop all claims on the house and the trust. It sounded reasonable on the surface, did it not? But 30 years of driving had taught me one thing. When the road ahead looks perfectly smooth, watch out. That smooth stretch often hides a sharp turn, and beyond that turn may be a cliff. I called Rodriguez and laid out the situation. She paused for a few seconds, then said something that made my stomach tighten. The only reason she would give up the house so easily is if she already has something else of value lined up, or if she is certain your son will hand her money later on. I hung up and sat in the recliner, thinking for a long time. What could Linda possibly have in her pocket? The cash was in joint accounts she could not touch. The jewelry had been donated to the church years ago. The only real assets left were this house and the Florida place. She was walking away from both. That meant she did not see a re about them. Later, Ilea reneged what she really wanted. During the divorce proceedings, the court scheduled a mediation session with a retired pastor. He was an old man with white hair and a slow, calm way of speaking. I was not required to attend, but I went anyway. I sat in a small room next to the mediation room, watching through a one-way mirror. Mark sat on one side of the table. Linda sat on the other, with her lawyer beside her. The mediation lasted about 2 hours. For the first hour and a half, they talked about property division and custody arrangements. Linda agreed to almost everything Mark proposed. She came across as reasonable and accommodating. Then, in the last 15 minutes, she pushed her water glass forward and spoke in a very even voice. She said there was one more thing. It was not about property, but she wanted it settled before the divorce was finalized. She had been managing Charlie's school fees, summer camps, and extracurricular activities for years. She had gone through her records and realized she had paid some expenses out of her own pocket. The total came to about $23,000. If Mark would reimburse her, they could draw a clean line on all future child-related costs and avoid further court battles. $23,000. That was what she had been after all along. That Mark did not answer right away. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, I never asked you to cover those expenses out of pocket. Every month, I sent you household money that included all of Charlie's costs. If you pull your bank statements, you will see that money was already there. You just did not use it on him. For the first time, Linda's face cracked. A small twitch at the corner of her mouth. Then she smoothed it over with a smile and whispered something to her lawyer. The mediation ended in that awkward silence. On the drive home, Mark was behind the wheel and I sat in the passenger seat. The streets of Detroit rolled past the window. Abandoned factories, freshly painted community centers, new coffee shops, old church spires. I watched the city change and thought about what it had looked like 30 years ago when I drove my rig down these same roads. Smoke still rose from the factories back then. Workers came out at noon to buy hot dog sandwiches. Everything looked different now, but some things stayed the same. You remember who treated you right. You also remember who tried to take advantage. I turned to Mark and said, do not give her that money. He nodded, but said nothing. He gave it anyway. Not because he wanted to, but because Charlie came home from school one day and said his mother had been crying on the phone. She told him she had nowhere to live after the divorce and could be afford her CAR payments. Charlie repeated that to Mark with a flat face, but Mark could see the kid was hurting. The next day, Mark had Rodriguez transfer $23,000 to Linda's account. He included a note stating that the payment settled all past child-related expenses and that no further financial obligations existed between them. Linda took the money. The very next day, she hired a new lawyer and filed a new claim. She demanded a full appraisal of our old house. She wanted half its market value. She had pocketed the cash, and now she had her teeth sunk into another piece of meat that the court set a trial date for December. Autumn passed like that. The leaves on the old oak tree in the yard turned yellow and fell, covering the ground in a thick layer. I swept them every morning with a rake, then sat on the porch with my coffee and watched the neighborhood come to life. Most of the neighbors were on my side. Now and then someone would stop and ask if I needed help with the leaves or a loose fence bow road. I thanked them all and said I could still manage on my own. But there was one person I did not expect to show up that one afternoon in early November. I was in the GA rage sorting through old tools when I heard a horn honk from the street. I walked out to the front gate. A brand new white Cadillac sat at the curb. Behind the wheel sat Bob. He had driven 3 days from Arizona, all because of that letter I had sent him. When he got out of the car, his legs moved with a slight limp, the same as mine. Old truck driver injuries that never quite healed. We stood at the gate and shook hands. No extra words. He patted my shoulder and said one thing. I am going to find you a witness. Bob had met someone in Arizona, a man who ran a nonprofit that specialized in elderly counseling. That man had once been a clerk for the California Superior Court. He knew the ins and outs of will disputes better than most. Bob called him, and the man said cases like mine were common across the country. The key was proving that the testator was of sound mind when the final will was signed and that no one had coerced him. My will was 10 years old, notarized, and witnessed. But Bob said it would help to find someone who was there that day and get a fresh sworn statement confirming the scene was normal and free of pressure. I thought about it for a while, and then it came back to me. 2 people had been there that day. One was my wife. The other was my wife's sister, Charlie's great-aunt. She lived in Ohio and was 81 years old now, but still shot RP as attack. She came to our house for Thanksgiving every year. I called her and told her the whole story from start to finish. She was quiet for a long time on the line. Then she said something that made my nose sting. I was right there next to my sister when she signed that paper. I watched her put her name down, 1 letter at a time. After she finished, she made a joke to the notary. She said, "Do not smudge the ink, because this house was bought with a lifetime of her savings." I remember every bit of it. She said she would come to Detroit to testify. With that promise, a weight lifted off my chest. Mark threw himself into preparation, meeting with Rodriguez often to go over documents. I had less to do during those weeks. My main job was picking Charlie up from school, helping him with homework, and watching Pistons games with him. The Pistons were having a rough season. They lost more than they won, but Charlie watched every game with the same intensity. A single win would make him happy for days. In late November, Linda issued a statement through the local media. She claimed she had been subjected to emotional neglect and financial suppression within the family. She called for public awareness of power imbalances between elderly family members and their caregivers. A few outlets picked it up. The comment sections lit up with arguments on both sides. Mark read that statement and sat in silence for hours. Then he stood up and said, "She is making herself the victim." I said, "Let her talk. People can say whatever they want. The judge looks at evidence." A week before the trial, Rodriguez called everyone into her office for a final run-through. She spread out the original will, the notary record, the written statements from both witnesses, Dr. Patel's mental evaluation, and Riss's legal opinion on why the unsigned codicil had no effect. She had compiled everything into one thick binder. She laid that binder on the table and looked at me and Mark. They have an unsigned draft with no witnesses and no legal standing, plus her own oral claims. Their only play is to question your mental state. But we have a doctor's evaluation, and it was done the day after the incident. That timeline covers everything. They cannot make that argument stick. I sat in the leather chair in Rodriguez's office and looked out at the gray Detroit sky. Across the street, an old office building had lost half its brick facade, but the coffee shop on the ground floor was full of people. This city had crawled back from bankruptcy on the backs of people like those. Ordinary folks who went to work, paid their taxes, raised their families, and did not start trouble, but would not back down from it either. That I thought about something my wife used to say. What is yours will stay yours. What is not yours will slip through your fingers no matter how hard you grab it. The trial landed on the first Tuesday of December. I wore a dark gray suit my wife had bought me years ago. It had hung in the closet most of that time, only coming out for church and funerals. Mark wore a white shirt and black trousers. Charlie took a half day off from school and sat in the gallery, still in his blue uniform. Bob sat next to him, stone-faced through the whole session, like a statue revered from granite. The judge was a woman in her 50s, last name Chun. She spoke fast but kept everything organized. Linda's new lawyer made the opening statement. He leaned heavily on ideas of information asymmetry within the family and the vulnerability of elderly individuals. The words sounded emotional, but he had no concrete proof to back them up. When Rodriguez rose to speak, she submitted the original will along with the notary certification. She submitted Dr. Patel's evaluation. Then she played a video deposition from Charlie's great-aunt. The video lasted less than 10 minutes, but one line cut through everything. She looked straight into the camera and said, "My sister was perfectly clear headed the day she signed that will." She even remembered she had to buy the Thanksgiving turkey the next morning. Linda sat at the defendant's table, hunched in her chair. She would not look in our direction. She wore a black coat and had lost weight since the spring. Her hair showed streaks of gray that had not been there before. Her parents sat behind her, their faces blank, like they were attending a meeting that had nothing to do with them. The hearing lasted nearly 3 hours. During a recess, Linda's lawyer stepped into the hallway and spoke with Rodriguez in low voices. Then they both walked into the judge's chambers. 10 minutes later, they came out. The judge announced a recess and said she would issue her ruling on a later date. But everyone in that room knew how it would go. When we walked out of the courthouse, the winter sun was breaking through the clouds. The light was cold but bright on the pavement. Bob slapped me on the back and said we were going out for steak that night, his treat. Charlie ran up to me, hitched his backpack higher on his shoulders, and looked up. "Grandpa, can we watch the game when we get home?" I said, "Yes. Pistons versus Celtics tonight." He smiled. It was his grandmother's smile. That night, the four of us, me, Mark, Charlie, and Bob, ate dinner at a steakhouse that had been on the corner for 40 years. Mark opened a bottle of red wine and poured half a glass for everyone, even letting Charlie have a sip. No one mentioned Linda. No one talked about the court. We swapped old stories from the trucking days, the ridiculous things we had seen on the road over the years. By the time we got home, the street was quiet and dark. I stood at the front door, fumbling for my keys. I looked up at the small iron plaque above the door frame, the one with our house number on it, the brass beneath it long turned green. I rubbed my thumb across that plaque, the way you greet an old friend. I pushed the door open and stepped into the living room. The Autumn Woods painting still hung in its place. I had dusted the frame, just Daisy Relier. I looked at that painting for a moment, then lowered myself into the old recliner and closed my eyes. Upstairs, I could hear Charlie humming in the bathroom. In the kitchen, Mark ran water over the dishes, then shut off the tap. Everything was quiet again. Judgment Day fell on a Friday. Detroit was overcast, and the wind blew hard enough to make the American flag outside the courthouse snap and flutter against the gray sky. I sat in the gallery, Bob on one side and Charlie on the other. Mark sat in the row ahead of us. The courtroom was sparsely filled. A few local reporters sat in the back row, scribbling in small notebooks. Judge Chin wore a black robe and sat high behind the bench. A stack of documents lay open in front of her. When she read the ruling, her voice stayed flat and emotionless, but I caught every word. The formal will was upheld. The supplemental document was invalid. All real estate, savings, and stock accounts were to be distributed according to the formal will. The Florida vacation house went to Charlie. The rest of the estate fell under Mark's management, with the trust established and Charlie to take full control when he turned 21. Linda held no ownership, usage, or benefit rights to any of the family's Shaw-Red property. The court also found that while Linda's actions did not rise to the level of a criminal offense, they constituted a serious breach of family trust. All legal costs were to be borne by the losing party. That meant Linda's side would pay the full cost of litigation and attorney fees. Linda sat at the defendant's table. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers laced together so tightly that the knuckles showed white. Strands of hair had come loose from her pinback style, hanging around her face. She had not bothered to smooth them down. Her parents sat behind her. Her mother kept her head down the entire time. Her father read at the ceiling. When the judge finished and rose from the bench, she exited through the side door. Linda's lawyer packed his briefcase, leaned over to whisper something to her, then walked out of the courtroom. Linda stood up slowly, swaying for just a moment. Her mother reached out and steadied her by the elbow. Linda did not look at us. She walked toward the exit, her heels clicking fast on the wooden floor. She pushed through the door and read into the hallway. The door swung shut behind her. That afternoon, we drove back to the house. Mark sat in the living room for a long time without speaking. I knew what was running through his head. No matter how ugly things had gotten, that woman had been his wife. She was still Charlie's mother. I walked over and sat beside him. I held out the television remote. He did not take it, but after a while he spoke. "Dad, if I had listened to you back then and not Ma ride her, none of this would have happened." I said, "If you had listened to me back then, you would not have gone to college either. You would be right here with me, turning wrenches in the GA rage. People make wrong choices. The point is fixing them." Mark let out a short laugh. It was strained, but it was a laugh the days after that passed like water running over smooth stones. The week before Christmas, Charlie's great-aunt took the train down from Ohio and stayed with us for a few days. The three of us, plus Charlie, roasted a turkey, made cranberry sauce from scratch, and simmered a pot of my wife's famous cream corn chowder. At dinner, the old lady told story after story. She talked about how I used to bring home bags of oranges from California every time I finished a westbound run. My wife would juice them, and the whole family would drink fresh orange juice for a week straight. On Christmas Eve, Charlie asked if he could take the painting off the wall and look at it. I lifted the autumn woods down and leaned it against the couch. Charlie crouched in front of it and studied it for a long time. He reached out and traced the edge of the frame with his fingertip. "Grandpa," he said, "Grandma painted this really well." I said, "She painted her whole life, but this one was her best, because it is the hills behind her hometown. She grew up there." Charlie nodded and did not ask anything else. That night, before he went to bed, he stopped at my door and said good night. I said good night back. After he left, I lay in bed and heard fireworks going off somewhere in the distance. A loud crack, then a low rumble that faded into the night. After the new year, Mark sta route taking care of things that had been put off for too long. He replaced the old asphalt shingles on the roof and painted the fence around the yard a fresh coat of white. I helped him where I could. My knees still cracked when I climbed the ladder, but my hands were steady enough. Bob had stayed in Detroit through February. He had planned to drive back to Arizona, but he changed his mind. He said there was nothing waiting for him out there anyway, so he rented a small apartment 2 streets over. He came by every morning for coffee. Sometimes we walked to the store together. The days were quiet and full. The Florida house transferred into Charlie's name in the spring. Mark and I talked it over and decided to take Charlie down for 2 weeks in the summer, let him play in the ocean. Charlie was so excited he bounced twice in the living room, then ran upstairs to light a candle in front of his grandmother's picture. She had been Catholic, but Charlie figured a candle was a candle, and nobody minded the mixed out in April. I was trimming the hedges when I heard the neighbors talking about Linda over the fence. The divorce had been finalized. She had moved to a small apartment in the suburbs and taken a job selling real estate. The $23,000 RS had been spent down to almost nothing. Her parents had stopped supporting her the way they used to. She had tried to contact Charlie twice, once by phone and once by text. She wanted to see him. Charlie showed me the text. I asked him what he thought. He said, "Grandpa, I do not want to see her right now." I nodded and handed his phone back. "When you are ready, you go?" He nodded and did not say anything more. In June, we went to Florida. The vacation house was not big. 2 bedrooms, a living room, a palm tree in the back with an old hammock slung beneath it. Charlie spent the first day splashing in the surf until his skin turned pink. Mark sat on a beach chair and read most of a book. I sat on the porch with a glass of lemonade and watched them both. The sun was going down, turning the ocean into a sheet of orange and pink. A few gulls flew low over the water, their calls half swallowed by the sound of the waves. I sat there and let my mind wander. I thought about the hills in Pittsburgh where my wife grew up. I thought about the 30 years I spent behind the wheel of a truck. I thought about the long nights on empty highways. I thought about my son when he was small, riding in the passenger seat beside me on short hauls. I thought about how he was a father now. I did not think of myself as anything special. I was just an old truck driver who had spent his whole life working. What I had Renette. Every dollar came from gripping a steering wheel. Every boa RD in this house had been nailed in by my own hands. I had the right to decide where it all went. And I had the strength to make sure that decision stood. That night, in that small Florida house, IHERDMARK talking to Cha Ralai in the next room. They were planning to rent a boat and go fishing the next morning. Cha Ralai's voice CA ride through the wall, full of excitement. He wanted to know if they could catch Shah RKS. MARK said no, but they could get flounder and snapper. Cha Ralai said that was good enough for him. I lay on the firm mattress under the ceiling fan that creaked as it turned. A small smile pulled at the corner of my mouth. A man does not need much in this life. He does not need to be young. He does not need to be rich. He does not need to be surrounded by people. What he needs is to stand up when it counts and speak when it matters. If I had stayed asleep that morning, if I had not heard Linda's footsteps in the study, if I had kept my eyes shut and let things play out, none of this would have turned out the way it did. But I woke up. I stood up. I said what had to be said. For that alone, this old man had lived a good life that the waves kept breaking outside, one after another. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and closed my eyes. Sleep came easy. Well, my friends, that is the story. I heard the bones of it from a retired trucker in Detroit who swore every detail was true. I filled in the rest the way a storyteller does. At our age, whatever we have in this world, we rened with ya RS of sweat, and we are. When the young ones treat us right, that is a blessing. But we cannot be blind to the ones with other intentions. The sooner you see the signs, the better off you will be. If this story sat well with you, drop me a comment or a like. Subscribe to my page if you have not already. I have plenty more where this came from. Tales from the truck stops. Secrets that old neighbors kept under their porches. Things that happened in the church basement that nobody talks about. We will get to all of it. Until next time, take care of yourselves.